From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We are absolutely thrilled that Reality has been released from prison and has begun the reentry process. And from this point, we press on in the fight to get her a pardon from the Biden administration.
NSA whistleblower, Reality winner, is released from prison into a halfway house after serving over 4 years for leaking documents about Russian meddling in the 2016 elections. We'll speak with her attorney. Then China's warning NATO is adopting a Cold War mentality after the military alliance singled out China and Russia for criticism at its summit in Brussels. We'll speak to historian Stephen Wertheim. His latest piece, Sorry Liberals, but you really shouldn't love NATO.
President Biden at the NATO summit said that the United States has made a sacred obligation to defend the 30 members of NATO. But does that mean that the United States is going to be defending Europe, dominating security affairs in that continent forever?
Then to Puerto Rico, which suffered a massive blackout last week, just days after the island's electrical system was privatized. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Joe Biden has wrapped up a NATO summit in Brussels, Belgium, ahead of a highly anticipated meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Geneva Wednesday. As talks wrapped up, China accused NATO of adopting a Cold War mentality after Biden successfully pushed the military alliance to declare China a security risk for the first time. NATO leaders also criticized Russia and called on Moscow to withdraw troops from Ukraine, Georgia, and the Republic of Moldova. Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with historian Stephen Wertheim. The World Health Organization warned Monday that coronavirus is spreading faster than the global distribution of vaccines. WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus was responding to a pledge by leaders of G7 to donate 1 billion vaccine doses to middle and low-income countries. That's just 613 million new doses on top of previously pledged aid.
This is a big help, but we need more, and we need them faster. More than 10,000 people are dying every day. During this press conference alone, more than 420 people will die. These communities need vaccines, and they need them now, not next year.
The World Health Organization says 11 billion doses are needed to fully vaccinate 70% of the world's population. COVID-19 infections are surging in at least 14 African nations, where confirmed cases rose by 26% in the first week of June. Just 0.6% of Africa's 1.3 billion people are fully vaccinated. Chile has ordered millions of residents of the capital, Santiago, back into lockdown as intensive care units near capacity. That's despite South America's most successful vaccination program, which has fully vaccinated nearly 60% of Chileans. Brazil's opened the Copa America soccer tournament despite one of the world's worst COVID outbreaks. Brazil's health ministry has identified more than 40 COVID cases connected with Copa America, including 31 players or staffers. As the tournament kicked off in Brasilia Sunday, indigenous people marched in protest.
We see the Copa America as an affront to the 500,000 deaths due to the misgovernance of this fascist government, which denied the vaccine to the Brazilian population, denied the vaccine to us indigenous peoples.
The United States death toll from COVID-19 has topped 600,000, even as the number of daily deaths fell to its lowest level since the pandemic was declared in March of last year. That's the highest official death toll of any country in the world, though disease experts at the University of Washington estimate the true U.S. death toll is over 924,000. On Monday, Vice President Kamala Harris traveled to South Carolina to kick off her tour promoting vaccinations in southern states, several of which have vaccination rates under 50%.
If you are vaccinated, you are protected. If your community is vaccinated, COVID rates in your community will go down.
CDC data shows U.S. coronavirus hotspots are clustered in areas with lower vaccination rates. Meanwhile, Vermont's become the first state to administer at least one vaccine dose to over 80% of its eligible population. Vermont Governor Phil Scott Monday said he's lifting all remaining coronavirus restrictions.
Because it's safe to do so. And it's safe because Vermonters have done their part to keep the virus from spreading and stepping up to get vaccinated. In fact, no state in the nation is in a better position to do this than we are.
Former National Security Agency contractor Reality Winner was released from prison Monday into a halfway house where she'll serve the remaining 6 months of her sentence. Winner was arrested in 2017, sentenced to 5 years in prison under the Espionage Act for leaking classified government information about Russian interference in the 2016 election. Prosecutors say Winner received the longest sentence ever given by a federal court for unauthorized disclosure of government information to the press. After headlines, we'll speak with Winner's attorney. On Capitol Hill, 3 Senate Republicans voted with Democrats Monday to confirm Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. The court's widely seen as a stepping stone to a nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. Her confirmation came as Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said Republicans would refuse to confirm any of President Biden's nominees to the Supreme Court in 2024 should a vacancy open. McConnell spoke Monday with conservative talk radio host Hugh Hewitt.
I think it's highly unlikely. In fact, no, I don't think either party, if it were different from the president, would confirm a Supreme Court nominee in the middle of an election.
During the same interview, Senator McConnell hinted he would also stonewall a Biden Supreme Court nominee in 2023 should Republicans take control of the Senate. A Chicago police officer who joined the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol has been arrested, becoming the 465th person charged in connection with the insurrection. Officer Carol Cheswick wore a Chicago Police Department sweatshirt as he texted selfies of himself breaching the offices of Senator Jeff Merkley. Meanwhile, weapons maker Boeing has resumed major campaign contributions to 3 Republican Congress members who voted to overturn the official certification of 2020's Electoral College votes. Congress member Jack Bergman, Vicky Hartzler, and Steve Scalise. Boeing briefly stopped campaign contributions in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. Georgia Republican Congressmember Marjorie Taylor Greene's apologized for equating mask mandates during the pandemic to the Holocaust when over 6 million people, most of them Jewish, were murdered by Nazi Germany. But Greene refused to retract her statement comparing Democrats to Nazis. Her comments came after she toured the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Monday. In West Virginia, the Poor People's Campaign led a moral march on Manchin in Charleston Monday, protesting Democratic Senator Joe Manchin's opposition to killing the filibuster. They also demanded Manchin reverse his opposition to the For the People Act, which would restore and expand the protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. This is Reverend William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign.
We ain't in this heat to play. Am I right about it? We not in these streets to play. We are here to bring street heat and moral heat to the legislative processes. The voices of the people in West Virginia will be heard. We are nonviolent, but we ain't playing. We will fight for the soul of this democracy because wages are at stake, infrastructure is at stake, voting rights are at stake, and we will fight for this democracy.
Senators Bernie Sanders, Ed Markey, and other progressive lawmakers are rejecting a bipartisan infrastructure bill negotiated by Democrats Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, along with Republican Mitt Romney. The compromise package calls for $580 billion in new spending, which climate activists say is far short of what's needed to avert a climate catastrophe. Meanwhile, dozens of youth climate activists marched across the Golden Gate Bridge Monday, capping a 266-mile march across California to demand officials take real action on the climate crisis. The protesters ended their march at the San Francisco home of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. This is 17-year-old Emma Govea. a member of the Sunrise Movement, one of the leaders of the march.
They are not being brave and they're not fighting hard enough to keep the climate in this infrastructure bill, to fight for the boldest, most well-funded civilian climate corps possible. And we understand the science. We know what is necessary. We are asking for their legislation to be at scale with the climate crisis. And frankly, everything that they're putting forward is too watered down. It's just not enough.
The protests came as California faces an historic drought, with firefighters preparing for a wildfire year they anticipate could rival last year's record-breaking season. In Rockton, Illinois, a massive fire at a chemical plant's continuing to burn for a second day amidst warnings of an unfolding environmental catastrophe. The Chemtool chemical plant northwest of Chicago erupted in flames Monday morning, billowing thick black smoke, prompting a mandatory evacuation order for all residents within 1 mile of the site. People within a 3-mile radius have been ordered to wear masks to avoid respiratory irritation. Rockton's fire chief said firefighters would allow the blaze to continue to burn for days in order to prevent hazardous runoff into the nearby Rock River. In Minneapolis, a driver slammed his car into a crowd of peaceful protesters who'd gathered Sunday at a vigil against police brutality, killing 1 person and injuring 3 others. The crash killed 31-year-old Diana Marie Erickson, a mother of 2 small daughters. Police arrested the driver, Nicholas Krause, on suspicion of vehicular homicide. He's a 35-year-old white man with a history of domestic violence and at least 5 convictions for driving while intoxicated. Protesters had gathered to demand justice for Winston Smith, a 32-year-old black father of 3 who was shot dead in Minneapolis June 3rd by members of a U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force. Minnesota officials said Smith fired a gun at officers who returned fire, striking him multiple times. Police say there's no evidence, there's no video of Smith's killing. A woman who was a passenger in the car disputed the police account, saying through her attorneys that she never saw a gun on Smith and never saw one in his vehicle. In Burma, the trial against opposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi began Monday. She faces a range of charges that the UN and others have condemned as politically motivated, including illegally possessing walkie-talkies and violating a state secrets law, totaling up to 15 years in prison. Suu Kyi has been under house arrest since she and other officials were ousted in a February 1st military coup. A local rights group says over 800 people have been killed, 4,300 arrested since the mass protests erupted in response to the coup. And the International Criminal Court seeking authorization from the Hague Tribunal to open investigation into possible crimes against humanity committed as part of Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte's brutal war on drugs. The crimes include murder, torture, and serious physical and mental harm. Since 2016, Duterte's war on drugs has claimed thousands of lives, including children. This is Normita Lopez, the mother of one of the victims. Her 23-year-old son was killed in May 2017 for allegedly resisting arrest during a sting operation.
When I heard the news about the International Criminal Court, I was happy. I thought the case would no longer prosper. If we filed the case against Duterte here, nothing would happen. Since he is the president, he can manipulate everything. He can do anything to avoid getting sued and imprisoned. When I heard the news about the ICC, I became more hopeful.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, the former National Security Agency contractor, Reality Winner, was released from prison Monday. She was arrested in 2017, sentenced to 5 years in prison under the Espionage Act for leaking classified government information. She worked at Fort Gordon in Georgia as a contractor with Pluribus International when federal law enforcement agents raided her house after determining she'd given reporters at The Intercept a secret document about Russian interference in the 2016 election. Prosecutors told the New York Times she got the longest sentence ever given by a federal court for unauthorized disclosure of government information to the press. Reality Winner was released from the Federal Medical Center Carswell, a prison in Fort Worth, Texas, and will serve the rest of her sentence over the next 6 months in a halfway house. Reality's family and legal team say she should receive a pardon and are calling for her sentence to be commuted. Last week, Reality winner's mother, Billie Winner Davis, addressed Biden on The Mehdi Hasan Show.
This is in his hands right now. My daughter has a petition for clemency with the United States pardon attorney, and all it's going to take is for his signature to commute her sentence to bring her home to us. And I believe that she deserves this. You know, the Trump administration persecuted Reality so strongly because of the information that she released. And the continued silence from this administration is a continued persecution.
For more, we go to Dallas to speak with Alice Grinter Allen, the lawyer handling Reality Winner's commutation and pardon process. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you talk about Reality being released, except not to freedom, but to a halfway house? Was her sentence in any way shortened by the White House or the Justice Department, or this was simply her serving out her term, as she continues to do in the halfway house?
Thank you, Amy, for having me. No, this is the normal release process. The last 6 months of a sentence are usually spent in the reentry process, which includes halfway houses. There's an infrastructure all over the country of halfway houses that help people readjust into normal life after incarceration.
And have you been able to speak to Winner after she was released? And do you have a sense that there's still a possibility for a pardon for her?
Well, I have spoken with her. I was fortunate to be there when she was released. She's in good health and excellent spirits. But the pardon process continues. The fight goes on regardless of whether she is in prison or not. She is a felon. She will have that on her record for life. And a pardon can still do quite a bit to improve her circumstances. But we believe that it's more important, probably, for the country. Reality released a document that gave us information that we needed to know at a time that we absolutely needed to know it. And she was in prison not because the information was a danger or put anyone in danger. She was in prison to salve the insecurities of one man who was concerned about the validity of his election win. And as we saw from the last 4 years, absolutely nothing could put those insecurities at rest.
Could you talk a little bit about exactly what happened? She was arrested by FBI agents in her home in Augusta, Georgia, back in June of 2017, just a couple of days after The Intercept published an expose. Could you talk about that?
Yes. Armed FBI agents came to her house and interrogated her in her own home, largely in order to avoid the idea that it was a custodial interrogation. They did not provide her with her Miranda rights or an attorney. And they eventually, she admitted that she was the one who had leaked the document, and she never saw the light of day again. She was incarcerated, denied pretrial release, and basically forced into a plea agreement for the longest sentence ever given for a release of classified information to the media.
Let me ask you about a Justice Department official who's leaving. This, according to AP, the Justice Department's tightening its rules around obtaining records from members of Congress. Attorney General Merrick Garland said, amidst revelations the department under Trump had secretly seized records from Democrats and members of the media. Garland's statement came as a Justice Department official said the top national security official, John, I think it's Demers, planned planned to leave by the end of next week. He was sworn in a few weeks after the subpoena of the Democrats' records, one of the few Trump appointees who's remained in the Biden administration. What's his involvement with Reality's case?
Well, his involvement is pretty crucial in Reality's case, but it's certainly not him. It's fairly clear that the national security arm of the DOJ was very willing to be political. National security at DOJ was running her entire prosecution. Everything was coming from Washington, and it was very clear from the beginning that this was going to be basically something that could be made an example of, that Reality could be made an example of and shown around to ice any kind of release of confidential information, especially information that embarrassed the president.
And in terms of this issue of embarrassing the president, wasn't the Intercept article that supposedly Reality provided documents for, where there was an NSA report from May of 2017 that showed that the agency was convinced that the Russian General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate, or the GRU, was responsible for interfering in the 2016 presidential election?
Exactly. We're not really sure when this information became top secret, because substantially the conclusions of the intelligence had been made public under the Obama administration. So it's not even clear when this information was made to be top secret that Reality released.
Any other message for the Biden administration, Allison?
This is a wrong that can be set right. And for the health of the country, I think it needs to be. We're living in such a divided society, and we are not going to be able to start healing until we forgive our truth tellers. And a pardon for Reality is an excellent first step for the country to start healing and putting this right.
Well, Allison Grinter-Allen, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Attorney for Reality winner who's just been released to a halfway house, will serve out her term till November there unless pardoned or sentence commuted. I want to end with the legendary whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, the former defense analyst who leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971, 50 years ago this week. We spent the hour with Dan Ellsberg Monday on Democracy Now! And afterwards continued to talk to him and asked him about the former U.S. intelligence analyst Daniel Hale, who was unexpectedly arrested and jailed ahead of his sentencing, which is scheduled for July 13th. In March, he pleaded guilty to one count of violating the World War I-era Espionage Act for leaking classified documents about the secretive U.S. drone and targeted assassination programs. This is Ellsberg speaking about Daniel Hale.
I think what he did was very admirable, and it was not only simply passing on some documents or some information, but really carrying on, as he should, a campaign against the murderous aspect of this campaign. He acted very admirably in a way that very, very few officials have ever done in showing the moral courage to separate themselves from criminal activities and wrongful activities of their own administration and resist them, as well as exposing them. So I would say he's a particularly admirable person, especially one that should not be put in prison for this.
To see the full hour with Dan Ellsberg, as well as our post-show interview, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. Next up, we turn to the historian Stephen Wertheim. As the NATO summit wraps up, he writes an op-ed piece in the New York Times headlined, "Sorry, liberals, but you really shouldn't love NATO." Stay with us.
Who knows what tomorrow will bring? Maybe sunshine and maybe rain. But as for me, I'll wait and see. and maybe it'll bring my love to me. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows any better than I? That is she who's keeping me alive. I'm keeping the little girl as my goal. It makes my life worth living, you know. Another day, just another day. I wanna live to share the love that only she can give. And if she don't come on home, I pray the Lord will help me carry on.
Who Knows by Marion Black. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. China's warning NATO is adopting a Cold War mentality after the military alliance singled out China and Russia for criticism during the NATO summit in Brussels that just wrapped. President Biden successfully pushed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to declare China to be a security risk for the first time. In its final communique, NATO leaders said, quote, China's stated ambitions and assertive behavior present systemic challenges to the rules-based international order, unquote. NATO leaders also criticized Russia and called on Moscow to withdraw troops from Ukraine, Georgia, and the Republic of Moldova. This is President Biden speaking in Brussels Monday.
There is a growing recognition over the last couple of years that we have new challenges, and we have Russia that is not acting in a way that is consistent with what we had hoped, and as well as China.
President Biden spoke alongside NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who also criticized China.
We are concerned by China's coercive policies, which stand in contrast to the fundamental values enshrined in the Washington Treaty. China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal with more warheads and a larger number of sophisticated delivery systems. NATO leaders called on China to uphold its international commitments and to act responsibly in the international system, including in space, cyber, and maritime domains, in keeping with its role as a major power.
The Chinese mission to the European Union responded to the NATO summit by saying, quote, NATO is slandering China's peaceful development and misjudging the international situation and its own role. That's end quote. Today, President Biden's meeting with European Union leaders before heading to Geneva for his summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. We're joined now by the historian Stephen Wertheim, director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute and a visiting faculty fellow at the Center for Global Legal Challenges at Yale Law School, author of the book Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of the U.S. Global Supremacy. He has a new article in the New York Times headlined, Sorry, Liberals, but you really shouldn't love NATO. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Stephen Wertheim. Why don't you talk about the NATO summit, this first ever hit on China and the way it was framed in the communique? Is President Biden leading to a new Cold War, both with China and Russia?
It's nice to be with you. I am concerned that indeed the administration may be moving toward a quite hostile posture toward China and Russia simultaneously. If it is doing so, it would be merely continuing a trend from the Trump administration, I must say. That said, though I think you are right to spotlight what was most remarkable about the outcome of yesterday's NATO summit, namely the identification of China as posing, quote unquote, systemic challenges to the so-called rules-based international order. I do think it's actually quite worrying as far as the European members of NATO are concerned. Europe has for quite some time been reluctant to cast China as a threat for understandable reasons. many Europeans, including the leading powers of Germany and France, don't want to make a choice economically or otherwise between the United States and China, or between the United States and Russia. And it has been the United States that has been most concerned about the threats from both countries. And so I think the NATO communique reflects NATO's desire to at least look like the European members are as concerned about China as the United States. But to the extent that the United States will indeed focus on competition with China in the longer term, that heralds a turn toward Asia and therefore away from Europe.
And Stephen Wertham, I wanted to ask you about this whole issue of the systemic challenge. The last time I looked, the United States had 800 military bases and installations in about 70 countries around the world. And apparently China only has 4 military bases anywhere in the world. They've got one in Argentina. They've got a small one in Djibouti, which is part of the whole international campaign against piracy. They've got one in Myanmar, and they've got one in Tajikistan. This doesn't sound like much of a threat to NATO or to the United States. And yet, and we're not even mentioning that Turkey has expanded all kinds of military bases as a member nation of NATO all around the world in recent years. So why is this obsession with presidents of the U.S., whether it's Biden or Trump, in continuing to paint China as some kind of a threat, not an economic competitor, which it is, and a growing economic competitor, but as a threat?
Well, it is worrying for the reason you say. The language of systemic competition and challenge to the rules-based international order seems to lump all of the issues that China's rise throws up. It lumps them together into one thing that seems to require a response in every domain. But China's record militarily is vastly different from that of even the United States over the last few decades. I'm sorry to say, it's not China that has scattered its troops all around the world on bases, as you say, or pursued missions to overturn regimes. China's behavior is very worrying in a lot of respect. And I do actually think that the United States and Europe have a lot to cooperate on in terms of setting standards for technologies, for digital, to set rules economically that might constrain Chinese action, to cooperate on climate change. There's plenty of things for the United States and Europe to do together. That's valuable, and that will, to some degree, constrain Chinese action, and that's a good thing. But NATO is a military alliance. We have to remember that. And so for NATO to be casting China in this way suggests that it does view China as something of a threat, although the NATO communique was careful to use the word threat toward Russia, but to use the less intense word challenge when it came to China.
And I'm wondering if you could comment on the G7, the new initiative they're calling Build Back Better for the World, or B3W, as a possible alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, because I don't think many people in the United States appreciate the impact that China's Belt and Road Initiative has had in the developing world, and also in the period of the pandemic, its efforts to export vaccines. I think it's now China has already exported 700 million doses to the rest of the world, which is about what the G7 is promising to do in the future, and it's already, my understanding is, providing 20 million vaccinations per day to its own people. Whereas here in the United States, we're at 2 million vaccinations per day. They're doing 20 million per day. How does this, both the Belt and Road Initiative and its vaccine diplomacy, having an impact on it, how the rest of the world sees China?
We saw the G7 on Friday act as though it needs to really meet China's activity in both of these domains, vaccines and development aid. And that could be a good thing if it ends up generating productive forms of competition, if it means that the G7 become more generous with their provision of vaccine doses, if it means that development aid becomes more plentiful, which it has not been from the West. This Build Back Better for the World thing is mostly a slogan or a hashtag at this point. It's got an abbreviation, the 3 Bs or whatever it is, before it really has substance. So we'll have to see what actually comes of it. The worrying aspect, though, would be that rather than create a kind of race to the top, we have a race to the bottom. And for the developing world, there are increasing strings attached, whether they make a choice between China's aid or U.S.-led Western aid. So we need only to think back to the Cold War to think about what may be in store going forward. If indeed this kind of intense security competition, something like a Cold War, does set in between the West and China. On the one hand, in the Cold War, some members of the global South were able to use their leverage, to use the interest of both sides to try to play them off each other and obtain more benefits. That could be good in certain circumstances, but then sometimes they found out that the superpowers were not pleased if they would take aid from one side, and such aid was cast as a threat to the other side and could lead to even the overthrow of governments. So at this early stage, I don't think we know which dynamic will prevail, but I have to say that the G7 did not come up with a terribly impressive number of vaccines that the members pledged to provide to the international facility that will be distributing vaccines. It was under 1 billion doses. Many, many more doses are needed, multiples of that number, in order to vaccinate the world. Now, perhaps this meeting will generate some momentum and further gains going forward, but it disappointed a lot of people and there was a lot of criticism from the former UK leader Gordon Brown and WHO officials.
You have, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago, the United States pledged something like 500 vaccines to Trinidad and Tobago, China 200,000. But I wanted to ask you, in your piece in the New York Times, you write, the danger of permanent subordination to America has started to register in European capitals, long solicitous of American commitment. President Macron of France has accused NATO of experiencing brain death and proposed creating an independent European army, independent of the United States. Can you talk about this? Well, there's a lot of backslapping and, oh, we're back together again in this 72-year-old military alliance that Trump said he wanted to get rid of. You also have a lot of tension here between European leaders and the United States, especially in the push against the pushback against China and Russia.
Yeah, I think this is the main story, actually, of the NATO summit. The narrative that NATO wants to tell is about all these actions that will be taken against China and Russia. But very little under the surface was this notion that America's commitment to NATO has come under question. And on both sides of the Atlantic, there's a reckoning with whether the interests of the United States and the interests of Europe and its leading powers really do align so closely as to bind them into this military alliance. And so President Biden was intent on having a clear statement that America is back and he repeated that America has a sacred obligation, sacred commitment, his words, to the collective defense provision of NATO. But this comes after, not only the Trump presidency, but stirrings within European capitals to realize that, as German Chancellor Angela Merkel put it, Europe must truly take its destiny into its own hands. And now strategic autonomy has become the watchword in Brussels, where the idea is that in some fashion, it would be the EU, independent of the United States, outside of NATO, that would become more of a force in security and military affairs. I think that's quite a sensible idea at this point in history. And I think even Biden understands that his words about a sacred commitment matter much less than what America actually does, not just under his administration, but long after. And in addition to that, I think we've come to a kind of inflection point in the history of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's now very hard to see how NATO could possibly expand any further. And yesterday, the Ukrainian President Zelensky tried to send out a tweet that he had gotten these assurances that Ukraine would indeed become a member of NATO, which it's been on a path to becoming, a very slow path, we should say, since 2008. And Biden was not very thrilled with that, it seemed, from the subsequent press conference in which he said, well, Ukraine has to meet its obligations to become a member. We'll see. The jury's not out, essentially. And I think we have come to a point where it's just very implausible, frankly, that Ukraine and Georgia would become NATO members and really pose a risk of direct conflict with Russia. So what the Biden administration has not done is close the door on further expansion of NATO. And that might be, frankly, a valuable step, not just for the United States and for the other members of NATO, but even for Ukraine itself, which is hoping for membership. But I fear it's being led down a false path, because the fact is that Germany and France oppose Ukraine's membership. They oppose it for very good reasons, because it risks conflict and further conflict, given that there is an ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine.
So, President, go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, I'm wondering, back in October, you wrote a piece headlined, America Has No Reason to Be So Powerful. And I'm wondering what the, given the fact, as I mentioned before, this continued huge military footprint of the United States around the world, once you have such a humongous military-industrial complex, it must always find enemies, doesn't it, to be able to justify its continued existence? And to what degree can the public or even some political leaders break away from this sense that the United States must be the policeman of the world?
I share that concern, and I think the fact that the United States had built up not just its military-industrial complex domestically, but also its relationships and military positions globally, that explains a lot of the kind of inertia that we saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you would think that the reason for being of this massive national security state had gone away. That said, I think we are seeing stirrings, at least, of change over the last decade or so. Everybody has to understand now that we are no longer living in the unipolar moment of the 1990s, when the United States was utterly dominant. Through that decade, it could cut its defense spending as a percentage of GDP, only to emerge in a more unrivaled position than ever before by the end of the decade. Well, the rest of the world has not exactly caught up, but other countries have asserted themselves, and China, most of all, has dramatically risen economically with military growth to match its economic growth. So I think that, most people in Washington, even if they don't agree with some of what I write, understand that real change is necessary, and the United States cannot possibly continue to be the guarantor of about half of the world against the other half of the world where most of humanity are, thus turning that half into explicit or implicit threats.
Stephen Wertheim, I wanted to ask you about what's about to happen on Wednesday. That's the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva. In a new interview on NBC, Putin criticized the United States for placing troops near the Russian border.
Imagine that we sent our troops into direct proximity to your borders. What would be your response? We didn't do that. We did it in our territory. You conducted war games in Alaska. Well, God bless you, but you crossed an ocean close to our borders, brought thousands of personnel and thousands of units of military equipment, and yet you believe that we are acting aggressively and somehow you're not. Just look at that, pot calling the kettle black.
Can you respond to this and also this back and forth, President Biden calling Putin a killer? Then NBC asked Putin about that. He laughed. And then when Biden was asked about Putin laughing, Biden laughed.
Well, I do think that both leaders are somewhat toning down their rhetorical barrages in advance of their summit, and that's probably a good thing. I do want to, give credit to the Biden administration and the president in particular for staunchly defending the value of diplomacy and making a point that the point of diplomacy is to meet with leaders of countries with whom we have issues. Otherwise, we can pack it up in terms of our diplomacy. So that's exactly right. And he's trying to kind of tone down the I would say, overheated rhetoric and personal rhetoric toward Vladimir Putin. I hope that the summit will prove productive beyond the symbolism, which is not without value itself. But the broader pattern, I think, needs to be considered of U.S. policy, where indeed the United States has placed troops and made defense commitments that now span most of Europe, going right up to the borders of Russia in the cases of the Baltics, and with Ukraine having a potential path toward membership in the U.S.-led NATO alliance. And it isn't surprising, and indeed was predicted by many people left and right and center back in the 1990s when NATO expansion was first put on the table and first endorsed. The Senate in 1998 held a vote to admit the first 3 new members of NATO. It was predicted at that time by many people. My piece in yesterday's New York Times cites the Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone, that the expansion of NATO would be seen by Russia, could not be seen otherwise by Russia, except as a threat to itself, even if for some period of time it wouldn't have the capacity to respond given its economic travails in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now that expansion has been taken, I fear, too far. And so we've created a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, and this is not to defend many of the actions that Russia has taken, including the annexation of Crimea, its support for separatists in the Donbass region of Ukraine. But, wise diplomats and political leaders will understand how other countries view their vital interests and listen to those countries when they repeatedly make clear what those vital interests are. So I fear that we've set ourselves on a path of a self-fulfilling prophecy in generating conflict. And what I worry about is that if the United States in particular doesn't break this pattern, it sets us up for the next 2-3 decades, my lifetime, my children's lifetime, to be at best involved in intense standoffs with Russia and China and perhaps others around the world. And at worst, it sets us up for a great power war. for World War III. Is that really what the American people need for the rest of the 21st century?
Historian Stephen Wertheim, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute, visiting faculty fellow at the Center for Global Legal Challenges at Yale Law School. We'll link to your piece in the New York Times, Sorry Liberals, but you really shouldn't love NATO. His book, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy. Coming up, we go to Puerto Rico, which suffered a massive blackout in the last days, just days after the island's electrical system was privatized. Back in 30 seconds.
Could have changed it. In the same way, we could have changed it. People don't change, that's what they say. People don't change, that's what they say. And we all have things to learn.
Change by Anika. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We end today's show in Puerto Rico, where nearly 1 million people lost power last Thursday after a fire at an electrical substation in the capital, San Juan. The massive blackout came just days after the private U.S. and Canadian company Luma Energy formally took over management of the island's electric grid from PREPA, that's the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, which was devastated by Hurricane Maria. Luma said it also faced a cyber attack shortly before a fire. Many people are still without power, facing ongoing blackouts. The Union for Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, for PREPA, fought to block the privatization. Puerto Rico's Fiscal Control Board, the mechanism put in place by Congress to manage its public debt, has pushed an austerity agenda that includes privatization of public assets like the electrical grid. This is Jocelyn Velasquez with the group in English, Promises Are Over.
It's the Financial Control Board that's promoting and imposing the Luma contract above the will of the people, above the will of the thousands of people who right now do not have power in their homes. That's the reason we are here today, because the board hides inside this building while it continues to reduce your pensions, while it continues to cut the funding of Puerto Rico's university, while it continues to cut funds for education and health.
For more, we go to Adjuntas, Puerto Rico, to speak with Arturo Masol Deja, who is the executive director of Casa Pueblo, House of the People, a community-based natural resources conservation and sustainable development group. He's also faculty member at University of Puerto Rico. Welcome back to Democracy Now! Last time you were in our studio. Now you're back in Puerto Rico. Talk about the significance of this blackout and the privatization of the power company.
Well, I have to say that the transition from the public utility to Luma had been happening for a year. Right after they took over 2 weeks ago, Puerto Rico started to confront different problems at different locations in multiple municipalities. And it seems like Luma had been incapable to fulfill their responsibilities. From 2,000 linemen, people that the public utility used to have, it was down to 700 because of the austerity measurements before Hurricane Maria, and now it's down to 300 in the private company. So it's impossible to keep the system running with that level of workforce. It's incredible. Instead of moving forward, we're going backwards, and people are getting in a hurricane mode. People are getting ready, taking measurements, like a hurricane or an earthquake just went through Puerto Rico. Incredible.
And Arturo Masol, I wanted to ask you, back in 2015, when this crisis, when the debt crisis in Puerto Rico finally erupted into public view, I said back then in a presentation that the crown jewels of Puerto Rico, as far as American capitalism was concerned, was PREPA, because at the time it was the largest publicly owned utility under any territory under the U.S. flag, and that there was going to be a privatization effort. I'm wondering if you can talk about how this developed and how now you're in a situation where not only are they trying to privatize or have successfully begun to privatize the electric system, but that they're preventing grassroots movements to develop solar energy.
This is a classic example of disaster capitalism. All the austerity measurement, this investment on the public utility caused all the problems that we confronted after Hurricane Maria, and that was used as an excuse to privatize, yes. And what that is setting is to perpetuate the model of colonialism over Puerto Rico by building a private monopoly instead of democratizing energy generation by having people investing in energy security. People, instead of being just consumers, become producers, and to participate in power generation in Puerto Rico. This is basically going the opposite direction. What they're doing is perpetuating the same centralized energy generation setup based on fossil fuels. It's not climate adaptation. It's not good for economic activation. It's good for them, for creating wealth based on Puerto Rico's exploitation. This is going the wrong way. It's not responsible with the climate challenge that we're facing in this planet, and it's not good for self-determination, for the future self-determination of Puerto Rico. What we should be doing is building energy independence, energy self-sufficiency, people producing their own energy, participating in the whole power structure, and putting Puerto Rico in a better position to make a political decision for our future. Even if we want to become a state, we need energy independence. And if we want to become a republic, an independent state, we need energy independence as well. So it's not just a political discussion about self-determination, it's actually the actions that we need to take. And the U.S. is not doing their part to do investments for the local well-being, is basically doing federal money transfer to Puerto Rico that are going directly to U.S. companies instead of Puerto Ricans.
Yeah, and we only have about a minute and a half left, but I wanted to ask you, the labor unions in Puerto Rico had planned a general strike in response to the privatization of the power system. Talk about the role of the unions, especially since the Electrical Workers Union had long had a history of being one of the most militant unions, but now most of its members have been laid off.
Yeah, well, actually, the labor union, I think it was a great asset of the public utility, and it has been dismantled. So that's the weakest part of the private utility right now. The workforce is not there. They're preparing to confront this privatization. I think Luma is doing the right thing. I mean, Luma is contributing because they're not fulfilling their part. People are getting angry, desperate, and we need to take action somehow.
Well, we want to thank you so much, Arturo Marsal, Executive Director of Casa Pueblo, speaking to us from Puerto Rico. We'll continue to follow what's happening there. Special thanks to Juan Carlos Davila. That does it for our show. Tomorrow, we'll be joined by the Nation publisher to talk about the Biden-Putin summit. And we'll also talk about ranked choice voting and the New York City mayoral race. That's tomorrow on Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guster, Nermeen Sheikh, Maratia Saina, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnock, Tarina Nadura. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe.